Good morning, everybody, and I will tell you this. I cannot make you the promise that I won't say the T word constantly. If you want to count, feel free. You're going to lose it pretty quickly within the first few minutes. I appreciate you having me here today. My name's Omar Nashashibi. I'm the founder of Inside the Beltway Solutions. I'm a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. I've been a lobbyist in Washington now for over 25 years. I've been working on tariff and trade issues since George W. Bush imposed the tariffs on steel back in 2002. We were hired by a manufacturing association. It's my job in Washington to work with the White House, to work with the agencies, to talk to USTR, to meet with members of Congress, their staff and committees. We work on a range of issues, whether it's trade and tariffs. We work on taxes, EPA, OSHA. I lobby on behalf of manufacturing associations. We also provide consulting services to companies that range everywhere from defense contractors to automotive to throughout the supply chain. My goal is not just to be their eyes and their ears, but also obviously their voice. Today, what we'd like to do is really try to help you understand what the heck is happening in Washington, D.C., which is no small task at all. This is a very different Trump administration than the first time around. We're seeing them move excruciatingly quickly. I appreciated the previous story about the CFO that spent 10 hours trying to understand a tariff, all to be a waste of time. I can one-up you. I went up to Jersey. I live in Washington, D.C. That's been home since the late 90s. I went to New Jersey, gave a presentation to a group of about 40 or so clients, and on the train back, Trump completely undid most of what I said. The client writes to me, well, that was a complete waste of time. I said, right, all right, thanks, Josh. I appreciate that as I'm getting home. That is the challenge that we're dealing with. How do you stay on top of this with Trump? How do you keep up with what's happening every day? I'll give you a quick anecdote. Here's how some decisions are made. And we heard this from a very, very senior Republican close to the White House on a complicated tax issue. It's the guilty for you tax professionals on international taxation. So the committee, the person that's talking to him says, Mr. President, in the Oval Office, we've got to get this fixed. We've got to get this done. He says, okay, call Stephen Miller and get it done today. So what do you mean? Usually you've got to discuss it. It involves literally every country in the world on dealing with pillar 1s and 2s and all these things. And in the end, what he says is, no, call Stephen. So Congressman calls up Stephen Miller, who's driving his kids to school. And he says, the president wants me to do what? Hold on, let me call you back. Calls up the president, gives him the instructions, says, okay. He calls back the congressman, says, all right, we'll get the executive order out tonight. And this is literally affecting trillions of dollars. That's how quickly they're moving. We also have to take away certain norms that we've gotten used to, exactly what you just heard in the previous presentation. The old ways of doing things are not the ways they are. When I got there, I remember my first event going to the White House. I was still in high school, and this is the mid-90s, and it was the Vietnam signing with Bill Clinton. Things have changed a lot in that town since Bill Clinton got there, and I got there too. Right now, when we look at free trade agreements, we have to throw them out the window in many ways. I had a client that has a South Korean parent, a company, and what they asked is, well, under the free trade agreement, the Korea-US agreement, and I cut them off. I said, why would the president care about a W. Bush-era trade agreement when he barely cares about the USMCA? We saw the comments yesterday that he says this is a transitionary agreement. What do you mean transitionary? The NAFTA and USMCA has been the bedrock of North American trade since the 90s. And most people forget that was negotiated by H.W. Bush in the late 80s. So now he's saying we don't necessarily need the USMCA. Throw out the old norms. They're moving quickly. And remember this one last anecdote. I'll give you one more story that I think might help you understand where this president's coming from with the courts. Governor Christie was governor of New Jersey. When Chris Christie was there, Trump comes to see him and they talk. The state is in dire financial straits. And Trump tells him, why don't you just declare bankruptcy? And Governor Christie says, I can't declare bankruptcy. I'm a state. It doesn't work that way. Trump says, don't worry about it. You'll get sued. You'll go through the courts. And by the time in 2 years when it's all settled and done, you got to fix the problem and no one's going to remember it anyway. That's part of it. Part of what they're dealing with right now. The president, some people tell the president, you can't do this under that law. Well, take me to court. And by then, the policy may already have had its intended impact. Whether you're dealing with certain issues on tariff policy that might be temporary, it causes people to relook and re-examine their supply lines. And as we go through this, understanding that we right now do have the highest tariff rates in history. That is bar none. When you look at every country right now, literally in the world, has a 10% tariff rate at minimum. Every country in the world currently faces a tariff. And as you can see these numbers, the president loves tariffs. When we break them down, and yes, I'm going to keep using the tariff word, when we break them down, we now have fees through the form of tariffs effectively on the mode of transport. So he's tariffing the vessels, he's tariffing the product, and he's tariffing the country. How do you keep track of this? How do you develop the systems when it's literally changing almost by the day? And we expect over the next several months for it to continue changing as these discussions, as the dialogues are ongoing. We just saw Bessette and Greer, the USTR and Treasury, are going to go to Switzerland to meet with the Chinese trade leader. And how's that going to go at the end of the week? Is that going to calm markets? Will it lead the president to drop the 125% tariff to a lower rate? When we look at the different categories of products, it's almost like that old Reagan line, that if it moves, tax it, if it stops moving, subsidize it. That's along the lines of where we are. The answer is tariffs. We take a look at Hollywood. That's a pretty significant. John Voight went to the president over the weekend and said Hollywood's got a problem, and the president's solution was tariffs, which technically is, not technically, it is illegal. It violates the Berman Amendment that specifically says you cannot impose tariffs on intellectual property, on books, on anything in digital or other format, such as that. But the president's going to do it anyway, potentially. He hasn't put out the order, but if he does, then he's going to move forward on that. And say, what? Sue me. Take me to court. And by then, might have had the intended impact anyway. So we've got tariffs on products coming in. Then we've got tariffs on derivatives of those products. And by that, he means products that might contain steel or aluminum, or products that might contain semiconductors. This is where we're heading right now. Every product that is critical to the president, the answer is going to be a tariff. How do you build those systems? And how do you understand this process? It's going to continue to go and evolve. The quick snapshot on where we are. People forget that there's still tariffs on China that the president put in place back in 2018. Those tariffs are still there. 25% tariff under the Section 301 action applies to 6,800 imports coming in from China right now. The media discounts that when they look at the 145% rate. It's 170 on 6,800 imports coming in from China right now. There's a 7.5% rate that's still hung over from the first Trump administration, and that's on 3,200 imports. That's still in effect right now, and that's how you get up to 152.5% on some of these tariffs. Under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that is the law the president's using. It dates back to 1977. It was put in place in response to Nixon. What that law has done over the years has only been used for sanctions, typically related to human rights abuse, to genocide. Never has it been used for tariffs. And that's where the court challenges are going to come in. They're going to focus on a few things. We look at the Supreme Court decision from last summer in the Loper case that relates to the Chevron deference from the 1980s. What this effectively said, the Supreme Court said, for any rules or laws that are not explicitly given to the agencies don't have the power to take that action. Well, what will happen now under that Supreme Court ruling that Republicans and the president wanted? Will the courts come back and say, no, you're not explicitly given the authority to impose tariffs under this International Emergency Economic Powers Act? And that's what the courts are going to have to do. Where is this heading? All the way up. This will go to the Supreme Court. There are court challenges, and that's what we have to understand. But the president isn't just using one trade law. He's using multiple trade laws that are out there. The president's using this IEEPA to establish that 10% baseline tariff on all countries. He's using that IEEPA for the 125% tariff on China. And then he's also using it for non-USMCA compliant products for Canada and Mexico. Why is he using the IEEPA? There is no check and balance from Capitol Hill. There is no investigation that needs to be undertaken. When he uses the Section 232 provision from the 1962 law, that takes time. It takes investigations. The president's not waiting 270 days, but he certainly is going to at least wait a few weeks, and we'll get to some examples of those. So the way we remember this, the IEEPAs are all countries, and then country specific after we get to July 9th and 10th. The 301s, as of now, are China only for what we'll discuss, and the 232s are product specific. So how do we work this through, and how do we look at this? We'll do another version of this at the very end, but right now, this is the slide that I use when I work with my clients that are in the manufacturing, distribution, in supply chains, because there are opportunities in tariffs. You have to know to find them. By breaking down those supply chains, And what we tell folks right now, like my son says to me, 13 years old, Dad, are electric vehicles good for the environment? I tell him, son, they're less bad. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to make things less bad. You're trying to outrun the competition, is what we're telling our manufacturers. There's two of you, one of you needs to outrun the bear, and that's who's going to win. You need to go to your customers and talk to them about tariff mitigation. Why you do not have exposure because you're not buying this machine from Europe, you're sourcing domestically. And then when you're developing systems to determine your exposure and your risk, you want to do it not just for yourself, but for your customers. Because what we tell our manufacturing clients is that it's not just about you, it's your customer and your customer's customer. What I'm hearing right now is a lot of the OEMs are on pause. They are slowing down their investments. They are waiting to see what's going to happen on July 10th when potentially the tariff rates go up from 10% to the average of 23% under this IEEPA that the president did. What happened? When we're all in the consulting phase, we talk about key dates, the election, then the swearing in. Then we started telling all our clients, hold off until April 2nd, Liberation Day. Do not make any permanent decisions because this president is going to make some changes. And that caused individuals to be on hold, and now they're on hold again. And how do we do this? All supply line decisions go through Washington, D.C. right now. No matter where you are in the world, you must factor in what's going on in the Oval Office. And as a lobbyist for 25 years, it's not as easy as me finding the right person to talk to. There's only one person to talk to in this administration. The first time around it was different. This time around, it is one person show only. As we go through these country tariffs, and we'll go through some of the products, and then you'll obviously have these available as you want to develop the systems and understanding where are the risks and opportunities, and then how do you price in what is considered temporary and may fluctuate on the whim of the president, and then what might be more permanent. In Washington, nothing's permanent. The next president can come change it. The next administration can change their mind. This administration can change his mind at any time. What we also want to look at is the warning that we received from the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. He told us, this is the Tax and Trade Committee, he said to us a few weeks ago, this 90-day pause, he can change his mind at any time. He can take it for a single country up at any moment back to the threat level of where it was. Right now, what he did on that April 2nd Liberation Day is he announced country-specific tariff rates that range anywhere from 10% up to 50%. You had Vietnam at 46. Why was that singled out so high? Because transshipment of products going from China through Vietnam entering the United States. You look at other countries such as Thailand that I think was 32 or 34%, and many others. The EU was at 20%. The economy reacted. The markets responded. The president lowered it down to that 10%. This time next year, you likely will still have a 10% rate on many, if not most countries. Our understanding from discussions is in these talks, the president's instructing his team to not work their way down to zero tariff rate, as you normally would in a free trade agreement, but work them down from the rate I posted on April 2nd to 10%. That's the more favorable rate that they're increasingly trying to look at. When you look at this individual rates of what the president did and proposed, that means that you've got to develop a system, not just by product, but then also by country, and then understand that it could change at any moment. We're not just waiting till July 9th and July 10th when that trigger comes in. And why do I keep referring to those dates? Because the president did not pause tariffs. Keep in mind, the president doesn't remove tariffs. That would be taking the threat and leverage off the table. This president will always keep that threat out there, whether it's Canada or Mexico or the Europeans, because he might need it later on. He didn't fully pause tariffs. He might have taken those rates down to 10%, but that 10% is significant. And how do you price that in? And here's the timing of this. When you're dealing with manufacturing in a heavy industry, I've got a client that is in Wisconsin. He's trying to bring in a machine from Germany. It costs $10 million. He called me on April 2nd because that was a pricey hit. And then we spoke after April 9th. He needs that machine in Wisconsin in service in October of this year. What does he do? That's $1 million this family-owned business does not have. But he's got to understand the timing of it, getting it on the water, getting it here. This is heavy equipment. But does he try to accelerate? Does he try to wait after what the president does? How do you deal with some of these issues? How do you deal with some of those areas? When we look at Canada and Mexico, those are receiving special attention because they're going to be in a different category that's out there. With Canada and Mexico, the president put on these tariffs And then he saw, again, the market reactions, just like on the IEPAs. What he's done with Canada and Mexico is he's imposed that 25% rate on all non-USMCA certified products. And especially for those in the automotive industry, this caught a lot of people by surprise because they weren't bothering to even certify their goods because the duty rate was negligible or didn't exist at all. And then came the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. They're singled out separately from those IEPAs. There's a 25% tariff rate on all non-USMCA certified goods. And what does that mean? It's the country of origin. The way U.S. trade law works, it's not from where the product is shipped, but where the product is actually made, where it's substantially transformed, or the form, shape, or function has been changed to assign it a new harmonized tariff schedule code, or a commodity number for the EU side. That area on Canada and Mexico is absolutely critical with this administration. Note that what the president did here, he took this action under the IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. But what did it say? Not a thing about trade. It didn't mention automotives, didn't talk about Canada, softwood, lumber, or dairy, didn't speak about Mexico, energy, or judiciary. This IEPA action only focused on the border, on immigration, on fentanyl. That is a tell. The president hasn't even gotten to the USMCA yet. This was an opening round on Canada and Mexico. He also always wants to take that first shot. And what does it mean to be certified, to have your product when you're speaking with your customer? It's filling out the form. It's going to the customs folks. And without that form filled out properly, you're paying a 25% tariff rate every time it crosses the border on the entire value of the good. Not just on the value added. If you're doing QC in Mexico, if you're doing packaging up in or anywhere else, or usually it's packaging in Mexico and QC in Canada, it doesn't matter. It's the entire value of the product, and you've got to price that in. And it's every time it crosses the border. I was with a client yesterday in Nashville, and they have an automotive part. It's 6 times is how many times it crosses into Canada and back into the United States. On that value of that automotive component, every time it comes back into the US, it gets hit. And if it's one of the products that's on the $23 billion worth of list from Canada, it's subject on a 25% tariffs on the way up. That's the retaliatory tariffs. Now it's back and forth, 6 times getting hit. How is that competitive? How is that a model on which you can make money? It's not. You need to understand the other strategies that are available to you, and that's why many of you are here today. As we look at that one example, that's the Canada and Mexico is the big lift that they're going to have to do. But bringing it back to these other countries where the president is on this is going to take some time. He's proposing that they negotiate literally with just about every country. That's going to be complicated. How are they going to do this? They're dividing them up into 3 different categories. You're going to have the U.S. Trade Representative take a group. You'll have the Commerce Department and then the Treasury Department. Those are going to be where they're all going to go. Your country will fall into one of those buckets, and we haven't even gotten to the products yet. This will take some time. What we're hearing is we're not looking at large free trade agreements, and we'll touch base on that in a little bit. But the president did impose these tariffs on all products with some exemptions. He has some exemptions for critical minerals, for example. You have to know what your harmonized tariff schedule code to identify that. He does have some exemptions when it comes to the area of semiconductors and cell phones. That was done at 10:36 p.m. on April the 11th. That's when the decisions are put out. If you want to stay on top of this, you have to subscribe to Customs and Border Protections when they put out their guidance from their cargo system. That's your cargo maintenance, all of that stuff. You're going to get 3 or 4 emails that are totally irrelevant today, but that one email you get will change everything. And the way they're doing this at 10:36 p.m. on a Friday night, and that's for products that are already on the water coming in for entry in an hour and 24 minutes. That's how much time you have to plan. And that's the challenge that you've got when you try to build these systems. That's how quickly this president is moving on providing these exemptions. I'm trying to get an answer on something and a change I can't get into, but I emailed the White House this morning saying we've got 7 days to get this done on the derivative inclusion process. Commerce is going to take too much time. Will we even bother going down this pathway? Because in the normal world, I'd go to the Commerce Department because that's who's running the tariff show for that product. No, if you need something, you need to go to the White House, you need to get an answer, and that's what these countries are trying to figure out. What does the president want? And frankly, we're not sure he knows that. But he does realize in his mind that they're all treating us unfairly, $200 billion deficits with Canada, so on and so forth. He did exempt some of these products that are out there on the reciprocal tariff list. And so it's also important within your pricing mechanism of a product, you can no longer think of your world as just SKU numbers. That's not what you're doing anymore. You have to understand what a harmonized tariff schedule code is. And what you'll see here on the left side are some products that are exempt, but you only know if they are if you know your numbers. Quickly, a harmonized tariff schedule codes. The United States government maintains 3.1 million different codes at the 10-digit level covering all imports and exports. If you do not know your code to at least the 8 or 10-digit level, you will not know if your product is on a tariff list or on a tariff exemption list. And you will not know how to put that into your system in order for it to not automatically trigger putting into the ledger a 25% tariff or a 125% tariff. It is essential. And for those that are interested, I spoke for 3 hours somehow yesterday, and during those 3 hours, I educated this group of family-owned manufacturing CEOs about HTS codes, how to find their own. I lobby for 4,000 companies across my 8 associations. I can't give them all their HTS codes, so I'm trying to teach them how to find it, how to use that to their advantage to go to their customers and say, no, my product is exempt. Therefore, and also their suppliers of metal in particular are just slapping the tariff on even if it doesn't apply. And then they're coming to me and I say, no, that's on a special list. That aluminum's at 10% because it's been defined as a critical mineral. And you need to know your HTS code because so is the zinc coming in from Canada. That is not at 25%, and you need to push back at your supplier's honest mistake. When we look at the individual countries that are out there, some are higher than others. As I mentioned, we got Vietnam at 46%, the EU came in at 20%. There wasn't a whole lot of math involved in this, folks. They started to come up with a formula. It got complicated real fast because the Trump said, well, let's figure out every single product, 3.1 million, and figure out what they're charging us, and then those 3.1 million products will come up with a special rate for each of those. Yeah, that was not going to happen on a Trump timeline. That's not in the world in which we operate. So then they just came up with some numbers of some different balances out there. You know, Taiwan's at 32% that's in there. Vietnam, as I mentioned, is at 46%. Going up and down the numbers. That's what makes this more complicated, that you now have to go individually to the president to negotiate these. And where are we? The agreement you're likely to hear about later this week with the United Kingdom is not a free trade agreement. It is not the FTA that the president initiated during the first few weeks of his first term in office. What the president is going to be doing is likely setting up frameworks or mini agreements. In our world of trade, not a trade attorney, trade lobbyist, the word agreement has a definition, and it means free trade agreement, which means removing barriers, eliminating tariffs. That's not what's going to happen because those also need votes on Capitol Hill, and I don't know if the votes are there. You'd need Democrats, and Democrats to get to 67 senators are going to want environmental and labor provisions that this president will not negotiate. Therefore, he's going to do side agreements. They might be challenged in court, and he'll say, what? Sue me. By the time it's done, it's done. And that's the strategies we see. Let's go through a couple of these here quickly. As you mentioned, the UK, it's going to likely be limited in scope to automotive and steel as of now, while they discuss further areas. The rumors that we're hearing is on steel and autos. It will allow for a quota system at a lower tariff rate, not eliminating the tariff. That is key. We'll see if the UK is pushing back based on what I've heard. But if the UK is successful in getting it down to a 0 rate on autos and steel, that's now a precedent that all other countries want. Is this president negotiating those tariffs for the UK down to 10%? That is the more likely scenario. That is the ask from the U.S. Trade Representative in the talks that are out there. So it's limited in scope in exchange for digital service tax being lowered or even exempted. We'll see what the end up language is on U.S. exports to the UK. That's step one. India is the big prize. The president needs a win. We call it a fly-in. I had 40 manufacturers in town last week for Capitol Hill visits, and in there you can hear it in Republican offices. They need to see the plan come through for the president because they're hearing it from their constituents. They need to see these trade deals. They need to see some calming in the markets. India will be the big one for his agricultural constituency. He needs a big win there. It will not be a big free trade agreement. Our understanding, it might come in two parts, where the Indians will make a certain amount of commitments and certain exchanges for exemptions or lowers or quotas on some of the existing tariffs. So the president is very good at doing a couple of things. One, he's very good at creating a crisis himself and then coming in and solving the problem and taking all the credit. The other thing he does very well is also taking credit for some things that are already in motion, whether it's for jobs already being created or otherwise. But the industry by that meaning CEOs, understand that they need to come to the president with something. These presidents, prime ministers, premiers, all of them know the same thing. They have to come to the president with something. The words coming out of Washington in March was, look at Claudia Sheinbaum from Mexico. Textbook of how to deal with Trump. She has managed it perfectly in terms of not escalating this situation that certainly could have been. And that's where we want to take a look at what comes next. So if we're looking at the latest on where we're going to be on free trade agreements, or rather agreements, mini agreements, frameworks, India, South Korea, and Japan are the three that we're looking at after this week on the UK. South Korea potentially after June 3rd because they're having a transition in government that's over there. But what again does he want? What are the outcomes that these countries can come to the table with? Well, often you're looking at it going back to import quotas, tariffs, eliminating non-tariff barriers and regulatory burdens on U.S. businesses. Is this what he wants? Don't know. It'll vary country by country. That's the challenge that you're going to have in developing a system. Whatever you build today, be flexible for tomorrow. Heck, be flexible for the end of the day, let alone for the right now, with the rate where we're going. Multiple court challenges. Where we'll end up is the Supreme Court. The Court of International Trade in New York is going to hear some of these consolidated cases together, but in the end, they're all going to have to go up to the Supreme Court for a decision on whether or not the president has these powers. That means everything that you've done can get undone. So now what do you do if you've got a customer that says, well, you know, I don't want to pay these tariffs. Why don't we put something in escrow together? Why don't we figure something out? Or how do I know at the end of this year he doesn't change his mind? And again, that's why you're here to discuss some of these strategies, because you need to build some of those in. We're going to give you a few quick examples here, and I like to do these slides because all of the numbers and the words that I've said don't make any sense. So IEPAs, 301s, 232s. Let's talk some numbers. This will help you understand where the tariffs are and how to put these into your systems. We've talked about the Section 301 tariffs. Let's say my product is on that 230 or is on that 301 list. You have to figure that out. There's a website at USTR. You need an 8-digit HTS code. You put it in. USTR will tell you what the tariff rate is right then and there. So let's say it's 25% on a product coming in from China. Then you add on the 10% from the February 4th IEPA action. Then you're adding on the other 10% when Trump was upset with China on March the 4th. He slapped on that other 10. That was the 45. Now, everything you're hearing in the media gets you up even higher. When you take a look and you add on the 125% the president did on April the 9th, it gets you to 170. That's how high that you can get. 170% tariff is almost non-competitive for most goods that are coming in from China based on conversations that I have. But you have to look at it, does it come in on list 4A? In that case, you're putting in a 7.5% and you're only at 152.5 only. Is this sustainable? The president has said a 145% is not sustainable. So where does that put it? Then you've got to go through and cancel it out. These don't play well together. There's guidance that came out that said if you have a product that appears today or in the future on the 232 goods list, then it cancels out the IEPA tariff. It will cancel out that 125% in the case of China. So now you've got to build into your system. If it sits on the 232s, I now have to eliminate that 125 line, and that's how I'm back down to 70. If your product is not on the steel list or the auto list, then you're leaving in that 125, and that's how you get to your 170. And this could change at any time because the president is not only doing this by country, he's doing this by product. And a product can be added to a list, a product can be a derivative of steel or aluminum. Let's take a look at what he did on March the 12th. He imposed tariffs that he already had since 2017-18 on imports of steel and aluminum at 25%. No exemptions. for countries, no exclusion process for products, meaning these tariff rates are going to apply. What he did there, imposing it on all countries, is now he has to bring those nations into him to ask for what? A deal, and negotiating it down. Is it a quota system? Is it a tariff? But this set the precedent here. What the president did, not only am I going to tariff the steel and aluminum that's coming in at 25%, I'm going to expand that process and allow companies and associations to petition the Commerce Department to add more products to the derivatives list of steel. What they did, when they established those steel and aluminum tariffs, they added 290 products to that list automatically as of March the 12th, and those products were already subject to that 25% tariff as of that date. You would have no idea if you didn't know your HTS code, that harmonized tariff schedule code. They had 167 across 4 steel chapters, and they had 123 aluminum derivatives across 11 HTS chapters. You'd have to know your number. This derivative process just opened on May the 1st. It's a 2-week process where companies can go in and ask the government to add a 25% tariff on the product they make in order to protect them from competition coming from overseas. This is going to be a process that happens 3 times a year. Another one will happen in September, and then again next January, and it'll be ongoing potentially. What it also means is within 60 days of an application, you'll have a response. This means that anyone's trying to price has to now track the portals, track the derivatives, track the items that are coming in that they didn't realize they had to be on their radar screen in live time. Same thing on automotives. Now that we've got that 25% tariff on autos for coming from the world, he did this again under the Section 232 national security tariffs. And what's important about the 232s? We do believe that when you're looking at the IEEPAs, the country tariffs are more for negotiations. When we look at the 232s, those are more related for industrial strategy. This president believes he can tariff his way to an industrial revolution. He does believe that imposing tariffs will bring back aluminum smelters and steel mills and heavy industry. He does believe that can happen on his watch in the next several years. And that is a challenge, but that's where we are right now with where the president is. He's applying these 232 tariffs everywhere. And now it goes on to automotive parts. And then you'll see how some of the OEMs react. So when I was with my manufacturers yesterday, I told them, where do we find opportunity in tariffs? This is where I find opportunity in tariffs. I look at this chart and I inverse it and I tell my sales team to sell, to call Volvo, to call VW, to call all these companies at the bottom of this list that have the smallest share of assemblies in the United States, because if they're not here, they're getting tariffed. Under the updated deal, after the autos went to the president, complained about this action, they got a deal. And you look at Stellantis and they said, well, 80% of our products now will not be facing a tariff. So they feel pretty good about themselves. But then you look at some of these others down there and you're in problems. The 232 tariffs are going to be ongoing. This is not a one-off and you're done this summer. This is not a July 9th or July 10th, because on July 10th, on those IEEPA tariffs, if countries don't have an agreement, either the president has to extend it to keep that 10%, or they're going to snap right back up to that top rate that's there. But these 232s are a tool the president's going to keep using. And why is he going to keep using them? Because the Supreme Court told him he can. The United States Supreme Court has held that under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, Congress gave away their power in this area of national security, and it's up to the president to determine what is a national security. And that is what allows him to impose these tariffs. So when we look at recourse, when we look at what might be lifted and challenged in court, the IEEPA tariffs are already underway. This is the other area that we look at. When we come back in here and we take a look at the 232s, this is a tool the president now knows he has. It's tried, true, trusted, and vetted by the highest court. And where does he go from here? This is a critical chart. This and the next one tells you what's coming next. You cannot just sit back and wait for those CBP postings. You need to start planning. This copper one, for example, most folks will glaze over and say, what's the big deal about copper? We don't make any in the United States. Why are we tariffing it? If he does impose a 25% tariff rate on copper, the way it's written is copper derivatives, brass, bronze, nickel. Those are just about everything that's an electrical connector in your world is going to be hit on this tariff list if it contains that. That's where they're going on the derivatives. We look at the next one down, semiconductors. The way that this is written, It's the derivative is anything that includes a semiconductor. All of you look down and around you. These are all subject to a tariff because virtually everything has a semiconductor in it today. That's how broad a scope that he's going with it. I was speaking last week in Milwaukee, and she said, I've got diabetes. What about pharmaceuticals? And I switched to my slide and says, he's about to hit a tariff on pharmaceuticals. We know that industry is going to him and pleading at least to exempt generic. But when you get into there, it also could include PPE because you've got a number of different categories that are included: respirators, masks. Those are all covered as a derivative in this action that's there under this pharmaceuticals. This is very significant. Under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the president has 270 days to decide whether or not to impose a tariff. There's zero chance, folks, he's taken 270 days on any of these. He's moving quickly. Once he's got these out there in the public, he's now checked the legal box that he needed to say, that he's conducting an investigation, and we're off to the races on more tariffs. More tariffs that are coming. When we look at the next one, medium heavy duty truck, we're doing this in order. That's going to cover 10,000 pounds and up. Your heavy duties are 26,001 and up. And it also includes parts. It includes specifically engines, transmissions, electrical connectors, all of those major components that you need. This is where we're heading. When we look at the next one as well, critical minerals. Just about everything contains a critical mineral, one of those defined by the U.S. Geological Survey in February of 2022. There's 50 of them. Anything that includes that in a finished good. Just about everything includes a critical mineral. That's why we call them critical minerals. And then he added on rare earths, 17 of them. He added on uranium. It keeps on going. And it's done with the stroke of a pen. These tariffs do not expire. When we were dealing with W. Bush on the steel tariffs back then, those tariffs had a start date and an end date under the 201 safeguard. That is a different law. Trump is not using that. He's using this open-ended 232 law on all of these issues, on lumber, on the movies, on what's next. Why did I put the movies on here? This is really important. Actually, FT did write it. Financial Times did write about it yesterday, which I was surprised that they got this. Someone must have explained it to them. But we do not impose tariffs on intellectual property. We do not do that as a country. There's a law that's actually called the Berman Amendment. I think it's the late 90s, because it talked about digital. And it specifically says that you cannot, under the law, impose tariffs on intellectual property. So this goes back to Trump. Sue me. Everything, the answer for him is tariffs. But why is this one important? If the president does move forward on using 232s on intellectual property, that opens the floodgates. This is not just about making movies in Hollywood. This could mean services. This could mean retaliation against the United States on exports of U.S. services, which is our primary export. And that is a fight that the president, we know, does not want, which is why he hasn't even gone there before. So how does he follow through on this? Us in the trade community are watching this movies one very, very closely because it is precedent setting in a way that we haven't seen. Those 3.1 million codes I mentioned, it's for tangible items. It's not on areas such as this. When we look at some of the other transport of the other vessels, and I'll go through this one quickly to give you an example of the thinking of where the president's going, he's using the trade laws to not only tariff again the goods and the country, but also now the mode of transport in the vessels that are coming in. So now not only are you tracking that HTS code in the SKU, you now got to figure out who owns the vessel that the product's coming in on, who built the vessel that the product's coming in on, and who's operating the product that the vessel that the product is coming in on. Why on earth would you ever need to know this information? Now you do, because there's a fee applied per container that you now have to put in there. $50 per net ton for the arriving vessel in there. You also have the containers, 20% to 100%, depending on the cranes that are put on there. Similar on this one. He also did it on automotive vehicles, so he's charging per car unit an additional fee that are coming in if it's on a Chinese vessel. All of these that are going in, the fees start kicking in here in October. $120 for each container discharge. October 14th, $18 per net ton for the arriving vessel. Take your pick. You have to get this in your systems. You have to figure out how often this is going to change. You have to talk to your customers and your clients about it. This is the new reality that we're in. Let me talk politics for a minute, because that's a lot of what I have to do in my life. The politics and the political reality are this. No Democrat or Republican that wants to win Pennsylvania in 2028 is going to walk in on a platform of, I'm going to lift all tariffs on China. That is just not going to happen. Zero chance of that happening. Tariffs are here to stay. The question is on whom, on how much, why, under which law, and then on what product. That's the reality that we're in. Democrats don't like the tariffs on the EU and on the allies and all those, but you go into some pockets where elections are won, the attitude tends to be a little bit different. And I travel the country quite frequently, and that's certainly some of the message I hear from certain pockets, while the disruption that's out there. The goal is to mitigate. You're not eliminating tariffs. Right now under Trump, the goal is to mitigate the client exposure to the tariffs that are out there and the tariffs that are coming, which is why I put that 232 chart out there for you. Every time you hear about a new action, understand under which law is he doing it. Is he doing it under the IEPA? Okay, there might be a challenge in the courts down the line. Is he doing it under the 232s? Note your product, learn your HTS codes. Please, it's very important that you assign your SKUs with an HTS code that for every product that's coming in for the foreseeable future. This is an exercise that if you build your systems now, when you get that notice at 10:36 p.m. on Friday night, and we were in Mexico, by the way, that was a rough week in Mexico. I had 10 hours on a Thursday on my computer one day with kids coming, Dad, are you coming out? I said, it's Trump, guys, just go outside. So what material, what machinery are you bringing in? And then we talked about your customers and their clients and their exposures. Try to get a better sense. I was talking to financial bankers last week and helping them say, well, is the OCC going to come down if my client's got too much tariff exposure? I said, no, you need to do that audit yourself. You need to be able to create these systems. Put up this bracket. Where are my primary areas of opportunity for myself, for my client, my client's customer, and then also for throughout that supply chain. So when we look at how do you start managing and pricing this in and understanding your strategies for pricing today through the year and through January of 2029, these are some of the boxes that we have our clients fill out because the president is just getting started, folks. We've only had 106 days so far since the president has been inaugurated. We've got 65 days since the president imposed those tariffs on China. We've only got 36 days so far since the president has been going on and on with more of these tariffs since Liberation Day. It's moving quickly. 65 days until these reciprocal tariffs take effect when they snap back in. And then we've got 1,355 more days left in Donald Trump's administration, folks, and he is just getting started. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me here today. We've got about 2 minutes or so we're happy to answer a few questions. I usually do more damage than solutions in many of these, but happy to try to clarify anything or answer any questions you might have. Please.
I've heard that there's a possibility for a buyback of the tariffs or the small company that you were talking about. I was asking if there was a buyback opportunity. You were talking about the company that was importing heavy equipment from Germany and adding that extra $1 million to it. I've heard there's like a 5-year window that they could actually apply for that tariff to come back if the tariff is rescinded within that 5 years.
We have not seen that language been out there. That might be an agreement that they might have created with their customer that's out. You do have some of the tariffs allow for what we call duty drawback. That's if you're importing the product for the purpose of then directly exporting it, so it's not coming into the United States for consumption. Some of the tax provisions do allow for a duty drawback provision. The president did allow for the Canada-Mexico stackable tariffs. He had 232 actions, one on autos and one on steel. They were actually stackable, so you'd have some steel, or between that and the IEPAs rather, were stackable. So you had steel coming in at 50% and aluminum at 35%. The president decoupled those and retroactively to March 4th, you can go back for a refund on that, but there isn't something that's in there unless you can go to customs and say we've got a false designation or we want to go out for an appeal because we've been doing it the wrong HTS code. But once you've put that money into the Treasury, it's gone off to the Treasury and you'd have to go through a significant process to try to claw that back. Any other questions, please?
Hi, thank you for that. That was really informative. I do have one question. I've worked with the federal government on systems on and off over the last 25 years. Do you have any idea how in the world they're going to be able to implement this, track it, enforce it? Because the chaos that's going on with our customers has got to be 1,000 times worse internally. So they're charging tariffs. Will they really know that you pay them or not? And how will they do that?
I got that question
They're not
yesterday.
great.
Right. I got that question yesterday in the context of enforcement. And how are they really going to enforce all of this? And people are now, you've seen was it the Journal or the Financial Times over the weekend, talked about how the Chinese companies are parking products in Thailand and then they're bringing them on through. How are they setting this up? Under the DOGE that they were moving forward on, it created some challenges. That exclusion process where you could used to be able to petition the government to not tariff your steel, they got rid of most of those people and disbanded that portal that was out there. So that means they don't have the resources at Commerce. We don't have a appropriations process for Congress to give Customs and CBP more money for enforcement. I'll just stop with the premise of your question is correct. They don't have the resources to do this, especially since they're doing it through Treasury, Commerce, and USTR. The U.S. Trade Representative has about 250 people that work there. That's it, 250. They have a lot on their plate. And the Commerce Department is kind of a little bit iffy, and there's a lot of career folks who know what they're doing, just don't want to work there anymore because of the current environment. So you're losing a lot of that institutional knowledge, and things are going to get a lot worse before they get better, particularly as these tariffs, because lastly, the president needs these tariffs to pay for the tax bill. You will not be getting rid of these tariffs as long as he's negotiating. Until he signs that reconciliation bill that I'm lobbying on tariffs, on taxes, these tariffs can't go away because they're a funding stream to an extent to offset the cost of the taxes that he's giving everybody else. So you're going to see continued uncertainty when that money starts coming in. There's going to be additional challenges there. I agree with you. Any other questions? Please. I'll take it. Of course.
When is the product taxed? Or what?
Yep. No, I've got it. I can repeat it for you. Yeah.
Is that before it leaves, when it
Sure.
arrives?
So the question is, at what point is that product subject to the tariff, and how do you pay the tariff, and what is that mechanism for it? It is subject to when it enters a United States port of entry. That can be the Virgin Islands, it can be a port of entry in the middle of the ocean, it can be in Baltimore, it can be anywhere else, but it has to be a U.S. port of entry. Typically what you're going to do is engage with a customs broker. That customs broker charges a fee based on what you're bringing in or sending out, and they will usually do the calculations for your HTS and so on and so forth. They will typically collect a fee. They have to do proof of funds for you to be able to pay those tariffs, and that's typically in the form of some kind of a bond or a deposit that you're putting in up front, and then it's drawn down. So in your calculations of your products, you need to factor in not only what is the tariff today, but what if somebody ticks off Trump and it goes up to 50% from 25%. You have to now potentially start thinking of, do I have to put even more money away for some of the variabilities for this president that's out there?
Do you see any move to do away with the bonded warehouse kind of policy that they'll target that?
Yeah.
That'll stay in place and kind of manage the supply chain?
Do you believe that they will do away with the policy of allowing for a bonded warehouse, or will they do away for that? That is an absolute strategy that is being used. The question is, I'm trying to wait out the president. And for how long are you going to wait him out? The 1,355 days you've got? That's an expensive warehouse. So then it really comes down to, what is the product that I'm trying to store, or from which country? Is there a realistic opportunity it may be withdrawn from the warehouse and not be subject to a tariff? But as of now, they are still allowing that. When you look at the CBP guidance, it does specifically still allow for that entry there. They will be watching if that does come out for entry into consumption into the United States without the tariff then ultimately paid. They will try to find a way to crack down on that. Who's going to do it? With what resources? That is a question we don't have an answer to, but as of now, it is still specifically written in. If they do start to see increased abuses rather than strategies, that may change in the future, but that is still in place as of now, and I have not heard that they're actively looking to eliminate it. Please.
I'll ask a question more at a macro level. When you look at US GDP over the last 10 years, it's done extremely well compared to Europe, Canada, that sort of thing. It has been that way because of all the friendships and alliances and that sort of thing. But at the same time, the US consumer has spent and is in debt and that sort of thing. Is this the part where it's accelerating history in terms of what every empire has gone through, whether it's the Roman, the Byzantine, the Ottoman, and all the other things? Is this just a shift in the global world?
I love that question. This is something I've been talking about since 2017. Do we end up in a situation where we've got the West has its own supply chain, Led by China, the East has its own, and India plays everybody off one another. And is that ultimately where we are in 2035? There is a good segment of the market that does believe we might end up in that direction. We know China's already trying to drive it there. We saw where Xi Jinping was in Laos, Cambodia, and Malaysia, now last week or the week before. He's in Russia either this week or next. He's meeting with the Arabs. He's going all over the place to try to establish those supply chains. They've learned from Belt and Road Initiative. What many policymakers in Washington don't understand, and this is exactly to the point here on the consumer, the United States has 25% of the world's consumers, but 4% of the world's population. This is not sustainable as an economic model if you're overseas and looking at a marketplace. Let's take BMW. They are the largest exporter of vehicles in this country from where? From South Carolina. And that's BMW. But they bring their engines in from Germany. And then they're exporting that product to, say, China. How is that a sustainable model to pay a 25% tariff on the engine coming in and then a 125% tariff going into China on that X7 that's going out? This is the beginning potentially of those, it's not a decoupling, but once you change supply chains, once you change those supply chains, it's tough to go back. And that's the question that many of my manufacturers are asking. What is that price point? And when their customers and former customers are waiting to see, do these tariffs stick? Or does the president renege and start to lower them? And that's why these POs aren't coming through right now. They're getting a quote activities up 30 to 40% across my clients, but they're not turning into purchase orders because many of those OEMs and tier ones are trying to see if Trump will change his mind. But if he doesn't change his mind and we get to the end of this year and we still have 170% tariffs on China, and I don't think we will, I think you'll see some progress this week. But even if it's 100% tariffs, by the end of this year, that does cause potentially folks to start looking at a shift in supply chains. And what does that do with the US economy, with the comments that the president made that we don't care about market access? That we've known. This president told us last time he didn't care about market access. You go into Joe Biden's office, any of his staff last time around and talk to them about market access, they'd kick you out. They say trade is about US jobs and US factories and US workers, not about you shipping your products and selling it overseas. And the Trump folks continue with that mentality as well. Any other questions? I've done enough damage. Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate you having me today.